call this meeting of the Tacoma Park City Council to order. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Mayor Williams.
I'm here.
Councilmember Barry. Councilmember Clay. Here. Councilmember Robinson.
Here.
Councilmember Siemens.
Present.
Councilmember Sniffer. Councilmember Wright.
Here.
Okay, are there any council comments? Councilmember Clay, welcome back.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I had a good time on my Disney cruise, and I came back to find that the Midwest is covered in water, and I have a lot of work to do. I had a couple of questions, one of which I already got the answer to, but there's been a lot of questions from constituents about the Jackson Boyd Park, and what I had heard from Public Works before I left for vacation was that they were going to have it done by the end of the fiscal year, which would be by June 30th, and I understand that we're waiting for some of the playground equipment now. Is that right? And that its arrival is imminent, and then they will install it. Maybe you could say something about that.
Yeah, the money for the project has been carried over to FY09, so what that indicates to me is the Public Works Director was very skeptical that everything would be installed by June 30th.
Okay.
But the understanding is that when the equipment comes, they are ready to proceed with the installation.
That's my
So
understanding.
it's supposed to start this fiscal year.
She carried over the entire remaining balance of the project. The way it works is whatever has been received or installed by June 30th would be billed against FY08. She carried over the remainder of the funding, which indicates to me that she's expecting most of the work to take place after July 1st.
Okay.
I can verify that with her tomorrow morning.
Okay, because I had emailed her last week, and she indicated that they were going to be working as soon as the equipment came in.
I had a constituent question about the ingress, egress to the fire station or the parking lot. I'm not sure because I didn't drive by and look at it tonight, but one of the sidewalk there is torn up and is all gravel. And so they're having a difficult time getting over it with the baby stroller, and there's not really an acceptable way to go across the street either and get back across because of the way the whole thing operates. And it would be great if, while they're cutting up the sidewalk along there, if they could cover it with something that you could run a stroller across, that would be terrific. And the other thing is just something that is an emerging issue in my ward, and I don't know if it's an emerging issue in anyone else's ward, but the long-term parking of storage units in front of properties is intensifying. And so we have a lot of them on Lincoln Avenue. They're hard to see around, and I understand that according to the permit process, there isn't a sunset on how long somebody could actually, they get a permit and they can just park it there, and there's not a time after which it has to be removed. So I don't know if anyone else is having the issue, but I'm getting complaints about them.
These are the storage units that people get to load up, then get put on a truck and moved?
Yeah, but people are using them as storage in front of their house. So, like, one of my neighbors was doing a basement renovation project, and they parked one in front of their house, and it was there for several months while they kept all their basement stuff in there and did their basement renovation project. Now, that was on Larch. That was a much wider street you could see around, but Lincoln is narrower, and I think there's 3 of them on there right now, I think just in my ward, and I've noticed that they're staying long. They're not just there for a week while someone loads them up and then they get hauled away, but they're being used as a longer-term storage solution in front of the house. And in keeping with that, also, just dumping things in the right-of-way, our mulch trucks come and they dump mulch, and if there's not a good place to dump it, they also dump that in the roadway and across the right-of-way, and then that stays there for a long time also, and forces people out into the lane of traffic to get around, which is, again, a problem on smaller, narrower streets like Lincoln, and not as much a problem on some of the wider streets.
I think I remember looking into the pod issue, is what I call them, those, because they're not really designed to take away. They're designed to be there as temporary storage while someone does a construction project. And the question came up in my ward, and there is a sunset time, but it was particularly long. I was surprised at how long, when you get the permit, it's like 6 months or 9 months or something like that.
So they get a permit from the city to put it there? Because,
If it's in the street, in the right of way.
yeah, well, they should. But I'm also thinking about if you put like a trash, a haul-away trash dumpster.
Same permit.
Sounds like there might be some thought about revisiting length of those permits. Because my thought is, if you're going to store stuff, you should store it on your property, not in the street. Have them put the pod on the property.
Yeah, or load it in and have it moved to the, they can pick them up and move them. They
Yeah.
do that. I priced it when I'm going to move some stuff from California. It's like $175 for, two giant pods to be stored per month. It's not cheap, but I don't know what the smaller ones cost.
Councilmember Wright.
Two things. One, I wanted to just say to my council colleagues, I haven't gotten a chance to speak to each one of you, or Terry and I haven't gotten a chance to speak with each one of you, but we intend to, related to coming up with a proposal for the budget process for next year. So my objective was to go around and talk to each person, see how they envisioned the process or what they wanted out of the process, and then try and put that together in some form for us to review prior to the recess. So just I hadn't forgotten about it. The second thing is a number of constituents in my ward have brought up the issue of power outages, and of course, they realize those are going to happen sometimes, but there is some concern, particularly in an area along Boston and Dundalk. I hope it wasn't anything that I said, Colleen, that made you upset.
No, try not to.
Particularly on Boston, between Tacoma and Philadelphia, and on Dundalk also. They were out for close to 3 days, and it seems like a lot of that has to do with the fact that there's only one line that runs into that area, so there's no redundancy. So if that one line goes out, it's a bit of a problem. So I'm going to write an email to you, Barb, sort of outlining this issue and seeing if we can talk to PEPCO about examining across the city where there are situations where there is no redundancy, because my speculation is that the severity of our weather patterns are only going to continue, and which means there's going to be more down power lines and power will be out more frequently, and I think that redundancy limits the number of people who get outages as well as potentially the time that they're out for. So that's something I think we should figure out a way to work with PEPCO across the entire city. If there's sort of weak spots in the transmission infrastructure, we should push them to upgrade or improve those situations.
And if I can just add one little trailer on that issue, I've seen a couple messages recently where people were saying, well, given all of this with the way things are going and electrical outages, they should just underground everything. And I just wanted to note that about 10 years ago, we got a figure, excuse me, of $1 million a mile to do that. And so that's only more expensive now, per lineal mile. So the cost would be prohibitive. Other council comments? Okay. Under additional agenda items and scheduling update, I'd just like to note that the council will be going to the Maryland Municipal League annual conference in Ocean City next week, so there will be no meeting next Monday, the 23rd, and the next meeting of the council will be on June 30th. Then we will meet in the month of July, and then we will go on recess in August. This is the time for public comment. If there's anybody who'd like to make any public comment, please come to the microphone and do so. Remember to keep your comments to 3 minutes, and identify yourself.
Is that King Loveless?
It's Pat Loveless. You know, they made me king of the Jazz Festival. And I want to tell everybody that Jazz Festival was tremendous. It was showing Tacoma Park at one of its finest. You know, our musicians were out there really great. People are out there. We had over 1,000 people, I heard. And we had the music, we had the parade, good food, good everything. And next year, I'm hoping that we can have a lot more people out there again. And everybody's been telling me that is a great location for a festival event down there, right down there in Old Town Tacoma, because the businesses can participate and sell their business and do their job, and also outside visitors had no problem getting in. It's right near the metro. It was tremendous, and they had a parade down there this time. You know, and of course, you heard they called me King Loveless, but I'm still a peace activist, by the way, and it was tremendous. I had a chance to talk with people about the different things going on in the city, and talk to a lot of other people. There were a lot of children down there, and it seemed to be an event fit for everybody, families and people without families. We all were able to get down there and have a great time, and it happens right about a good time too, right at the end of the school year, because people are saying it was a great way to round out the year. A couple of kids were telling me that it was a great way to round out the year, and it was tremendous. I had the peace sign down there to remind people that Tacoma Park is and should still stay a city of peace, working as activists to try and make our country a better place and our city a better place. And yeah, we also had a place down there where people could register to vote, which I'm very fond of, because you know, kids are going to be graduating this year. A lot of people are going to be entering adulthood, and the best way to do that, to enter the rite of passage, is a voter registration card. You know, I'd like to see if this year the people could carry on the tradition of the Jazz Festival so we can have them next year. Not to drink, not to drive, not to drug, and to remember that we can, and we as a city should pull together to make that a reality. And I know we can do it. We did the Jazz Festival. We got the folk festivals coming up. We got other events coming up. The 4th of July coming up. Let's make it a better city. Let's continue on in the spirit of the Jazz Festival. Let's make it a peaceful Tacoma Park. Carry on. Thank you very much for letting me share. And I want to thank the city for putting on such a wonderful event. Thank you very much.
Pat, your timing is back right on target.
Love it.
You do better than everybody who can see that timer.
Well, I can hear.
And I'll just make one quick comment on the timing on the Jazz Festival. I'm glad people thought it was a good time to be doing it. I know that the crowd might have been bigger if there hadn't been a conflict with both Father's Day and the Gay Pride Festival downtown. Next is City Manager's comments.
Included in your agenda packet is my belated quarterly report for January 1st through March 31st. I think normally I try to get this out within a few weeks after the end of the quarter, but obviously the FY 2009 budget took precedence. Hopefully the council's had a chance to read the report, which is just sort of a highlight of activities and work done by the staff during the first quarter of this calendar year. Just a couple things that I would just like to highlight that I guess struck me as I was typing this, and would like to send some kudos out to certain staff members, and that would be Carla Kelly of the Recreation Department, who in the first quarter of the year implemented the city's first community service learning camp, which gave a number of teams an opportunity to be exposed to a number of very worthwhile organizations, including certain organizations dealing with homelessness and HIV and AIDS groups, as well as helping out getting some things ready for the Cherry Blossom Festival. And also Clayton White, and I think he was the person who implemented the Holla at Me program that I think some of the council members had asked for information about earlier. One of the things that also strikes me every time I do this report is just the amazing amount of work that is done by Mary Kendall and Gretchen Hilberger of the CSAFE staff. Certainly they do a lot of work in partnership, but every time I go to type this and there's all these bullets dealing with the CSAFE staff, you'd never think that was done in large part by two very talented young ladies who are on our staff. One of the projects that I mentioned, and there's a handout at your places at the dais this evening, is the two-county Turning Point mural project, which I think the council is familiar with. There will actually be a dedication ceremony tomorrow at 11 o'clock, and there's a handout at your places at the dais. County executive is scheduled to be there, as well as Senator Harrington, Prince George's County Executive Jack Johnson, and State Senator Jamie Raskin. So if any of the council members would be available tomorrow at 11, I'm sure the CSA staff and the police department in general would be very appreciative if the council could attend. Just want to take the opportunity to clarify, so there was a lot of confusion today with the massive water main break in the northern part of the county. Initially, those of us spend a lot of time in their car like I do would hear that it wasn't a problem for anyone who was within the Beltway. For reasons unknown to the staff, somehow Tacoma Park ended up being listed as one of the communities where the boil water order was in effect. Our staff talked to numerous folks at WSSC trying to figure out how in the Beltway community ended up being on a list of having to boil water. Took basically a good number of calls and through the day to finally get WSSC to confirm that in fact we did not have to, our residents did not have to boil water, but in the interim we did get a news release out just so that folks knew we really were not in a position, though we thought there was probably some sort of internal error on WSSC's part. We really couldn't tell our residents not to comply just for health reasons. So if anyone is watching and still unclear about that, you don't have to boil your water. The last thing I just wanted to mention, and usually like to try to take an opportunity to highlight accomplishments by some of our staff, and this is someone that the council works very closely with, which is Peggy Washington, the executive assistant in my office. A couple years ago, Peggy chose, with my support, to become very active in the International Association of Administrative Professionals. That is an international organization, as its name would imply, and she's been very active, particularly in the Montgomery County chapter. Pleased to share with the council tonight that Peggy was selected as the Member of the Year by the Montgomery County chapter, and also received an award from the district, which includes Delaware, Maryland, and the District of Columbia, recognizing her for her commitment to excellence. So if you happen to see Peggy, I'm sure she'd appreciate getting a kudos from the council as well. So that's it, unless there's any questions from the council.
I just have one question that follows on the content of your report, but it's nothing you have to answer.
Okay.
I'm just looking for a little feedback, and it doesn't have to be now, from the council. There were two items in there that caught my attention, one of which we already have scheduled an update, which is on the Verizon FiOS build-out. We have somebody scheduled to come and brief the council about that, and I saw that in your report that they're assuming that sometime midsummer they'll be finished. And the other thing that struck me that I thought might be good to get a briefing on was there were a number of items about municipal infractions, and I was thinking about the number of questions that have come up from residents about how that process works and an understanding of how that process works. And if my colleagues agree, maybe we can schedule a briefing on that so that we all have a clear understanding of what the process is, how long it takes, and some of the difficulties in it. So let me know. You know, I'm seeing a couple nods, yes, but I think it might be helpful to do that.
I definitely agree with the first one, to have a briefing. The second one, I would go for a briefing or just a written memo that sort of explains the process. Either one would be okay with me, but if others want a briefing, I'd be okay with it.
Okay. Because I was also thinking about a number of residents have had that question, and some of their questions have brought out things that I didn't know, and I felt it might just be good to have something out there that people could look at and check. Okay. Any other questions of the city manager? All right, then we'll move on to the special session, and the first item is a resolution authorizing submission of the Maryland Municipal League legislative action, and Suzanne Ludlow is going to introduce that.
Thank you. On June 2nd, the City Council discussed this item in work session. Each year we submit proposals for the Maryland Municipal League to consider as its legislative priorities for the upcoming year. In the discussion that we had on June 2nd, the council agreed to put forward a request to were to enhance just revenue opportunities in general for municipalities in Maryland. And in order for us to transmit the form that has that suggestion, we need a resolution saying that that's what you want to do, and that's what is here today. I can answer any questions, but I think it was pretty well discussed the previous time.
Would somebody like to introduce the resolution?
Second.
Moved by Councilmember Sniffer, seconded by Councilmember Siemens. Is there any council discussion? Any public comment? Seeing none, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The ayes have it. And we will now move to the resolution of support for a Class B beer, wine, liquor, alcohol beverage license for Tijuana Mexican Cafe. And David Souls is going to introduce that item. And we also have the owner of the
We
cafe.
have Mr. Escobar from the owner of Tijuana's Mexican Cafe, and his son and daughter is here today.
Welcome to all of you.
Thank you for the invite. Thank you for the support. So Mr. Escobar is requesting support from the city for his application for a beer, wine, and liquor license for Tijuana's Mexican Cafe. It's at 949 University Boulevard. It opened last year, and Mr. Escobar has restaurants in Silver Spring and Rockville as well. And he's here tonight to answer any questions you might have.
Okay. I was just going to say that my recollection is that either the previous business that was there or a previous business that was there were some difficulties, and the city ended up opposing the license there. Have we gotten any correspondence from anybody, any of the neighbors or anybody indicating any opposition?
Yes, the previous business, Anna's Cafe, was there, and they closed down. Their liquor license was revoked. Mr. Escobar has reached out to Councilmember Berry and the local business association, led by Erwin Mack, and spoken with both of them. I reached out to ask for community meetings. There is no dissent. There's no feedback from the community saying that they saw anything wrong with this liquor license application.
Okay. Councilmember Sniffer.
Thank you. Are there any other businesses right nearby that have a liquor license? I was trying to remember. Not really.
Samantha's Cafe.
Samantha's the closest, right?
Yeah. How far is Samantha?
Like a block?
Oh,
No.
it's it's up at Honey Branch and University.
And this is on University and what?
Near Carroll. Near Carroll.
And Merrimack.
Well, I've eaten at your restaurant a number of times. It's very good. I enjoy the atmosphere, and I think a liquor license would be a great addition. It's hard to have Mexican food without a beer. I confess. So I'm definitely in support of it. We've eaten at your other restaurants too, by the way. They're all good.
Thank you.
Councilmember Siemens.
Thank you. Mr. Escobar, I'm interested if you could describe some of what your business is like. Is it sit-down dinners? Do you plan to have a bar where the alcoholic beverages are served? Is this a in-house consumption only, or will they be able to take alcoholic beverages off of the premises?
No, just I try to make a family restaurant, just to sit down, drink it, to beer or wine with a meal, But we don't have a bar. We just have a little canteen.
It's just for like in the restaurant. It's not
It's
going to
for
be
the
anything
restaurant.
outside of the restaurant.
No.
We're not expecting to have, any major incidents.
As the mayor explained, that that particular establishment has had a lot of difficulties in the past, and the neighborhood felt that a lot of those difficulties focused on the alcoholic beverages that were consumed there at the place. And also, I think, just reading the newspapers, you know, your restaurant is in a challenged neighborhood. And so we need to get some assurances from you that, you know, the clientele of your restaurant is going to be people that aren't going to get into trouble with alcohol.
Yeah, I don't think we're going to expect that. Hopefully, I mean, we're going to try to avoid that. We're really going to put our emphasis onto food instead of alcohol. That's what I think we're going to try to do, like 60-40 instead of like the whole 50-50 deal with food and alcohol.
We try to sell more food than alcohol. Yeah.
And it is
More
just
fun.
beer, it is just beer and wine that you're giving?
It's also a liquor license.
Also liquor.
Yeah.
Because some
Because of
people
the
they ask
margaritas
for
and stuff
that,
like that.
margarita.
The typical Mexican drinks.
Councilmember Wright.
Well, I thank you for taking the risk of opening a restaurant because it's a tough endeavor, and I realize that liquor licenses really help contribute to the bottom line and make restaurants profitable. So I would be supportive of this, and I would just ask, and I'm sure you will, that you distribute the liquor responsibly and be aware of how many drinks people have had and that sort of stuff. And sounds like you guys are trying to run a very family-oriented business, and I would be supportive, and thank you for your efforts to have your business in our community.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, thank you.
Councilmember Barry.
Oh, thank you very much. You've got me completely out of breath. Welcome, and it's good to see you again. I know that this dialogue began almost last summer, I think. We met, and you came, and we discussed in some detail your plans for the restaurant, which was not then open. And what impressed me was your excellent track record at operating your other restaurant in Tijuana, Silver Spring. Maybe you have one. The Tijuana Cafe in Silver Spring. And subsequent to that, I made a number of inquiries about your track record in Silver Spring and found a very positive record on the part of the Montgomery County Police Department, which gave you very high marks for the management of your establishment there. We also had discussions with some of the neighbors who had been on the receiving end of the previous owner's irresponsibility when it came to serving alcohol as part of the business there. And naturally, those feelings were very raw with some of them, and in particular the Sligo, the Adventist school, and some of the other neighbors. And I recall during that time when Honest Cafe was in full swing, as it were, the police were visiting there almost 1 out of every 3 nights during the course of the entire year. And finally, the license was revoked. But there was a lot of ill will, frankly, in the community. And I think a lot of that has gone away now, and I think everybody is willing to and has welcomed your establishment. And I think most people are quite willing to give you a chance to operate the liquor license responsibly. And I find nothing in your background that would give me pause to support the granting of the license. I think you will operate responsibly, and I think you bring to the area a great track record for managing an excellent restaurant, which the area needs, and I have no doubt that with the license you'll be even more successful than you've been. And I welcome you to the community and look forward to working with you in many years in the future. Thank you.
Thank you too. I try to be the best. I try to make a nice restaurant. I want to make a good family restaurant. Try to.
Any other questions? Would somebody like to move the resolution?
Moved.
Moved by Councilmember Wright, seconded by Councilmember Barry. Any further comments? Is there any public comment? Seeing none, all those in favor of the resolution, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The ayes have it.
And I like to buy, we have the heating 19, this one. We have 19, heating 10:30. I like to, if you want to come with me,
The 19th?
19. 19, yeah.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good luck.
Buena suerte.
Yeah, thank you. I can leave it the minutes.
Yes.
Shall we read the items off the menu?
Next item is the consent agenda. We have 4 resolutions, one providing for reappointment to the Nuclear Free Tacoma Park Committee, one providing for appointment to the Emergency Preparedness Committee, a single reading ordinance authorizing execution of contract for mechanical engineering services, and a single reading ordinance authorizing purchase of replacement decorative street light poles and fixtures. Okay, all those in favor of the consent agenda, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Oh, we have to do roll call. I even wrote myself a note and I still forgot.
Don't we have to move it?
Yes.
I moved the consent agenda.
Consent agendas are just too easy to just blow right through. So I think we had a motion to move the consent agenda from Councilmember Clay and a second from Councilmember Wright. And will the clerk please call a roll?
Mayor Wade.
Aye.
Councilmember Barry.
Aye.
Councilmember Clay.
Aye.
Councilmember Robinson.
Aye.
Councilmember Siemens.
Aye.
Councilmember Sniffer.
Aye.
Councilmember Wright.
Aye.
I'm going to just have to put myself a big sticker on the agendas when I get a consent agenda that goes stop. I think we can now move along to our work session, which is discussion of city committee operations. And depending on how that discussion goes, then we can take a break as appropriate and continue it. I'm hopeful that this discussion will get us where we need to be on this topic. We have had some fits and starts at this, and I think the information provided by the city clerk, I hope, will go a long way toward getting us where we need to be on this. I think what I'd like to do is just get any overall general comments, if anybody has any, including any sense of, after having looked at the packet of information, whether there's anything missing here, and then we can go through in some detail the information in the packet and provide our comments, changes, whatever. And then the sense is that once we have come up with our draft of what this will look like, then we will be sending it out for comment to the committees and let people have a chance to get back to us, and then we'll move forward. So first, are there any general overall comments on what's here, the process, anything that seems to be missing? Member Sniffer.
Thank you, Mayor Williams. First, I would like to thank staff for putting together this set of documents. It's very impressive. I didn't see anything that was missing or anything that I wanted to see that wasn't here. I appreciate especially the inclusion of some staff summary of issues and comments in the different sections. I thought that was very helpful. Also, the background material of including the actual ordinances and so on answered some other concerns that I had. So I just wanted to thank the staff for putting this together. I thought it was a really impressive piece of work. And it reminded me of just how much people in Tacoma Park are willing to volunteer for. It's pretty amazing. I talked to people in other communities who have struggled with just a handful of citizen committee, and we have a huge number, and they do a tremendous amount of work. I don't know how the city would function without them. Thank you.
Any other general comments? Councilmember Siemens.
Thank you. I too appreciate the work the staff has done in pulling this together. I noticed one thing that one committee that is listed as an advisory committee that I'm not sure that's the role that they play, and that's the Emergency Preparedness Committee. If it is a council advisory committee, it seems completely inappropriate that we would have a co-chair of a staff member. And I think the majority of the work that that committee does is more in line with support of staff and actually doing work rather than advising this council. So I think that belongs more appropriately in maybe than hybrid or committees established by resolution.
Good point. I can see where it probably belongs in the hybrid category.
Right.
Um,
And then aside, or in addition to that, the one thing that seemed to be missing from this is, and we had talked about this council giving clearer direction to the committees on what our expectations are. And I don't see, I don't know if this is the right document for that, or if that's something that is separate from what we're doing here tonight.
I was looking at something here and I missed the first part of your sentence, so I don't know what you're talking about.
Okay, that's okay. I say I'm not sure whether this document would be the right place to include the council giving clearer direction to the committees, advisory committees, on what we want them to work on. It might be appropriate for all the committees, but I think especially the advisory committees, that this council should give clearer direction to the committees for tasks that we hope for them to accomplish. I think one example would be some of the questions that have come up recently with Public Safety Citizens Advisory Committee on should they work on deprioritizing enforcement of marijuana laws. I think rather than the advisory committee spending a lot of time on that without clear direction from the council, it would be inappropriate for the committee to do that. I understand there are residents of the city who are interested in looking at that, but I don't think the residents should use the committee to meet their particular desires. I think the council should be giving direction to the committees on what we want them to work on. And again, I'm not taking position on deprioritizing the enforcement of marijuana laws. I'm just saying that I think we should be giving the committees clear direction on what we want them to work on and when we want to see answers back. But again, I go back to my first sentence, which was I'm not sure if this is the right document where that goes.
Well, what I'm looking at is it's on page 6, the annual review of committees, where it says all committees shall report to the council at least annually. At the time of the report, the council will evaluate the mission of the committee, discuss any changes recommended, and make a determination as to whether the committee should continue for at least one more year. It would seem that
I think that would be
during the report of the committee back to the council, that it's a time to bring up any issues like that and get direction from us. And my recollection is that we've had one or two discussions with that committee on that particular case, both with the committee and with when individuals came up for appointment. And I thought provided some direction on that. So I think those are the kinds of things that take place as we talk with the committee when they come back for their review. But I don't think we want to get too specific in this document, other than to, about particular directions, other than to say that it's appropriate that we give them direction.
I think I agree with you up to a point. I think that it should be in this document, and whether it's under annual review of committees or a separate item immediately above that says that the council shall provide clear direction to the advisory committees on what tasks we want them to work on. And again, I think of the Public Safety Policy Committee, the Committee on the Environment. There's every one of these advisory committees. I think it should be clear that we should be giving, we and future councils should be giving direction to the committees.
Right. I just want to make sure that with that direction, that we're not telling the committees they can only work on what we've told them they can work on, because they're going to have other issues that come up and want to vet them a little bit and bring them to us as possibilities for things that they might want to work on. And the city clerk has a comment.
Also on page 9, we attempted to address that somewhat in a separate section on reporting to the council. And in their annual report, the committee should provide information on your activities in the past year and, where appropriate, provide a work plan or set of deliverables for council review and consideration.
Right, again, I think that those are good, but they're the wrong direction. In other words, it's from the committee to the council. I think the council should have a clear role defined in here, that if the council should be providing direction to the committees. And certainly we would want to consider the committee's interest in that.
I think that's probably the point at which it's appropriate to say that it works both ways. And that's
The appropriate at the point to do what?
that there's information coming from the committee back to the council in their discussion with us about what they have worked on and what they might work on and what the work plan is, and it's the time for us to provide our thoughts as to about what that should be. So it's a two-way street, and that all takes place. And I think it belongs in that section. Councilmember Robinson.
I'm glad this is part of this discussion. Terry, I also think that we ought to refer to how we give counsel to the public, or how we give guidance to these committees. We need to think of that. And we do set our priorities every year. And this year, if I recollect correctly, it was fiscal restraint and service to the community and sustainability. Those were kind of the top three, as I recall. Am I right? Does that ring a bell?
Mm-hmm.
So, and that was with a great deal of work with staff and discussion amongst ourselves. So that's our guidance for ourselves, our priorities for the year. And it seems to me that each of these committees needs to review and reflect on what they're doing and try to make a determination as to whether what they're doing fits into our priorities. And if they have questions, as it's noted here, they can come for a clarification. So that makes sense. And as they come for their annual review, if we can come back to our own priorities and say, well, tell us how what you're doing furthers our agenda here, or what we feel are the greatest priorities. And if they have additional information which will help us review and refine our priorities or shift direction during our next review of our own priorities, then that would be helpful as well. So I agree that it's two-way. I think that the priority should be an active part of this document, and that we should keep our priorities in mind whenever we're talking to the committees.
Did I see? I thought I saw it. Yes. That's where we're ready.
I would agree that it's a two-way street. I just think we should have explicit language in there to describe sort of the fact that the council is going to dictate some specific things that they want to work on, want the committees to work on, and a date by which the committee would get back to the council on that, as well as a way for the committee to propose things they want to work on, and the council to say yes, or maybe in some cases no, we prefer actually if you didn't spend time on that. I just think there should be some explicit language in there to kind of sort that out, because I know some of the committees are having internal battles about that, and that's what they're battling about and spending their time on, as opposed to actually getting work done.
Right. Just so long as people are saying that there should be language that says what the process should be, but not that anybody's advocating for specific language in here about particular issues.
Correct.
That's what I thought I heard people saying, but I wanted to make sure.
I very much like the idea of a council liaison committed to the committees or assigned to the committees. Probably more on the advisory committees. I think we probably don't want to have council liaisons committed to the quasi-judicial. That could get us into some uncomfortable situations. The hybrid ones also, because they have a quasi-judicial function in them, probably not, but much more along the advisory committees and the committees established by resolution. I'd like if we could come up with some better language around the residency issue, because it feels very squishy to me and perhaps arbitrary, and I think that can result in people feeling feeling like we're being very subjective as opposed to objective about making decisions about people being in or out based on residency. I would actually like to see the review period of the committee maybe detailed by committee, because my feeling is that an annual review of the committee might be okay for some committees, and maybe it's depends on the time, how relevant the issue is. But I don't really like the idea of the Committee on the Environment only coming to us once a year. I think actually they should probably come to us quarterly or at least twice a year, and that way it actually helps them to meet their deliverables because they know they have a time they have to come back to us. Maybe the nuclear free zone committee rate at the point where that issue is and with the city only needs to come to report to us once a year. So either we should, I think, specify that by committee, or it should say something that the council will designate how often a committee will come annually.
The annual review section says that all committees shall report to the city council at least annually, and I believe the thought when we set that up was that we would time those reviews in sync with the date of the expiration of the appointments, so that way everything got staged through the year, unless there was a reason to do it differently, and that still gives flexibility to move it around and to have more than one.
Yeah, I think it does give you the flexibility, but I think it doesn't, at least, and I don't know the exact language, the language doesn't suggest the importance of having timely reporting. Because if we actually want them to do things and deliver things back to us, telling them once a year, we might as well not ask them to do anything, because it's just so long between updates and connection for us in terms of reloading and thinking about what the issues are, and also for them feeling some sense of urgency on actually delivering those things. And I think if you asked for fewer things to be delivered in that short period of time, and they were really focused on those few things, then the next time those things would get delivered, you'd have answers, and new things could be assigned or agreed upon.
Anybody have any thoughts on the reporting? Take your pick.
Okay. Well, if there was a liaison, I'm trying to get a grip on the liaison. From one of us would be a liaison to the different committees, and not the quasi-judicial. I agree. I think that's wise. Although visits from time to time, so for our own edification, might be helpful in reporting back. There seem to be about 12 committees here. I think we have 12 committees under hybrids, advisory, and committees established by resolution. So each of us would have one or two committees we'd be a liaison to. And going to them would be a way to get information back to us, either by issue or by problem or something to resolve. And in a sense, that's like reporting back. So that could be part of the reporting back, and that person who's the liaison could help establish when it was an appropriate time for each committee to come back.
Let me just add that I hadn't necessarily been thinking of, at least tonight, in terms of the liaisons providing that function for the reporting back, but I like that because it, instead of saying, okay, there's 20 minutes or whatever it is here in the council with maybe the chair and one or two others, if the committee knows that the liaison is going to come to a committee meeting, there's a better chance for a fuller understanding of the issue, of discussion of the issue between the liaison and potentially a lot more of the committee in a little bit longer discussion that may actually get things where we want them to be a lot easier than just reporting back here.
Right.
I thought we were going to kind of go
Well, we
one
were.
by one. So it's, I don't know exactly, should I comment on all the things said so far or not? Or we're going to, anyway.
Well, we were going to do this, and then I was going to try and just go back in order and make sure that we had what we wanted on all these sections. So,
I have one more thing, so I can do it after you guys, but I do have one, because we didn't get through all mine. I have one more item.
Sure. I like it. I guess one concern I have is, for me, many of the issues are committee-specific. So, residency things, for example. Some committees, they clearly should be Tacoma Park residents, and some will have other people on them. And it's pretty much spelled out as it is. If Councilmember Wright is referring to having a tighter definition of residency when somebody moves out of the city, I'd support tuning up that part of it, but not, I don't think we need an overall, some kind of overarching resident kind of issue. The issue of liaison came up, and I'm of two minds of that, on that. The concern I have is that it's, my observation is that if a council member is on a committee, it will become that council member's committee. If they're attending it on some really pretty frequent basis, or they attend on a particular issue, for a particular issue, then I have a concern that, I don't want to say they take over the committee, but they would carry an extra vote in agenda setting and what people work on and the views and so on. It's pretty hard to, for either the committee or the council member to avoid that. The committee looks to the council member as having an extra voice, and the council member just speaks up. So I have a concern about having liaisons where it's very frequent. I can imagine a once a year thing or twice a year thing, infrequent, so then you wouldn't have this issue of twisting or the danger of twisting the agenda. I think we talked about reporting so far. Also, I think myself, I much prefer having a little discussion when they report. And if we want them to report more frequently, I think that's a good idea if it's dependent on that there be an issue that reporting for reporting's, extra reporting for extra reporting's sake is not what I'm after. So I think there should be a way to determine whether a committee needs to report more often than once a year. And I wouldn't be the least surprised if it, in one year we saw a committee that was working very actively on a couple of projects. We saw them several times a year. And another committee that just was in a period when not much was happening. So I would be not too interested in setting up a regular schedule. I'd rather do the scheduling of reporting when we discuss what the committee is going to do for the next year. And set up come back to us in a quarter, come back to us in 6 months. So I prefer doing reporting then. I think that's all we've talked about so far.
Maybe I'll go back to Councilmember Wright if you had another general comment, and then we'll move through these, taking into account any of the specifics that we've already talked about, and see if we can come to some consensus on these pieces as we go through.
The only other thing that I wanted to bring up was that I think we need to have some sort of structure for two things. One is how it is decided that either other committees or organizations get to have a seat on a committee. And then, if that's the case, how do we decide whether they just get to appoint that person, or is that an appointment and then that's approved by the council? I think there should be some process around that. And I sort of feel like this, and related to the residency requirement, is I think about a little bit like the Constitution. Like the Constitution is set up with these very specific rules and checks and balances, so that you rarely get into hot water about being totally subjective about it. There's a set of really solid rules that make logical sense, that stand the test of time and will deal with unforeseen conflicts that might come up. And I realize some of those conflicts only reside in, or are only in issues in one committee at this time, but they could be issues in other committees. And to as much as possible, we can design the rules such that it would help us avoid those conflicts in general. If that makes sense.
Councilmember Stevenson.
Thank you. Just a real quick follow-up to Councilmember Snipper's observations about the council liaison. I agree with the points that he made, and I also have a similar concern with the staff liaison, that I understand that the committees do like to have somebody else do their paperwork for them with minutes and typing the agenda and things like that. I think in the past, the committees have worked well without that, except that we didn't enforce the need for minutes all the time. And my concern is that the same thing that Councilmember Snipper mentioned with council liaison is that it can, having a staff member present at all the meetings and involved in setting the agendas for all the meetings can have a undue influence on the business of the committees.
Councilmember Barry.
Thank you. I have a slightly different view on the liaison, although I certainly appreciate the concerns that were expressed. It could also work in a different way, and that is the council liaison could help with the filtering of information, and maybe more importantly, the focus of the committee by bringing to these committee meetings a sense of what we're looking for, what kinds of policy recommendations, for example, we might like to see, or what sort of priority projects we might want to consider. And in doing so, might be able to save a considerable amount of effort on the part of the committee members who, as I've observed it over the years, and this is true of some of the committees, but not all, they do seem to have a penchant for generating enormous laundry lists of projects that then are kind of dumped on us, not by their design, but by the design or lack of design of when we have them do their reporting. Generally, they take place, it seems to me, in one part of the year when we're busy with all kinds of other things. And as you see, there's 8 advisory committees that are probably more likely to generate large numbers of proposals. And then going into the new year, we have the Health Services Impact Committee and the WH Land Use Committee. They're also going to be generating a lot of things. So it's the sequencing of them coming before us that is a concern to me, and that we not get ourselves into a position that we've been in the past where everything comes at once in a storm of all kinds of other things. And as we've seen, we get overwhelmed by proposals, almost to the point where a kind of paralysis sets in, and we can't seem to see the forest for the tree. The other concern I have about the staff is a different one, and that is the amount of staff time going into these kinds of things, whether it's sort of support services they're being asked to perform, or whether they're asked to provide their expertise. It's real hours that is a tendency to come from the same people who we count on week after week for their expertise, who we assign various kinds of things. And I think one issue that we don't have here, but probably we should talk a little bit more about, is are there ways of being more selective about the staff time that is committed to these kinds of committees? Can we get by with less rather than more? I'm not worried about the staff going off the ranch and trying to influence the outcome of these committees. I'm more worried from a cost-benefit standpoint that we're spending a lot of time doing things that maybe we would want those folks, our folks, to be doing otherwise. The other concern that I had too is, it's not on here, is the chairs of the committees. it seems to me that we might want to consider limiting the number of times a chairperson can be the chair, so that we don't get into situations where we have chairs without end, perpetual chairs, and wouldn't it be better, for the sake of having new thinking, to try to find a way to limit the terms, the number of times that a chair can be elected to be a chair by the members of the committee, so that we do get some fresh thinking from time to time and give those folks who have been perennial chairs, even though they've done wonderful work, and I commend them for all the time that they spend. I think on occasions, and in certain committees in particular, we need on occasion a break in the cycle.
And if I can just point out on that last point that as we get to the bylaws and rules of procedure section, the third bullet attempts to address that issue. Councilmember Robbins.
Yeah, I think the council liaison and staff liaison are crucial, and I appreciate what the fears and the pros and cons of what other council members have said. And I also note Council Member Wright's notion of a kind of a constitution, and it may be that we delineate what the intent of our going to a committee meeting is. What would the intent be? I could see something along the lines of, it's our intent to help them clarify what's real. I have a little story about that. I was contacted by a constituent today who was curious about a rain barrel and other stormwater program in Montgomery County, and she had found that the bennies from the county, including a rebate in some instances for things that you do in the county, is not available in Tacoma Park. And said, why don't we have this? She said, why don't we have this program, or why don't we have access? So I contacted the head of the Department of Public Works, and she said, oh yeah, I know about that program. We have a different stormwater fund. They have a separate stormwater fund. They do a certain review of a person's backyard. They review a survey or a form that goes out, and they make certain recommendations and so forth. And frankly, we don't have the resources, either human resources or fiscal resources in our budget to do that here. So it's too bad. Well, my constituent said, well, when are we going to get these resources? And why can't we have them now? Which is a valid question, and stormwater is an important issue. And what crossed my mind as I was kind of filtering between staff and my constituent was staff makes decisions based on what the direction they have and the resources they have. They're not going to appeal to everybody, or not going to satisfy everybody. There may be a really good role for a committee to formulate another way to provide the kind of service or value that is available at the county, as an example. And so that is, to me, an example of how that kind of reality check of what can we offer, what can our staff offer, when the committees cook something up, something they think is important, what chance does it have of flying in our city, given our own finances and the way we staff things? And I think that's a really important thing, whether it's staff that provides that kind of reality check, or whether it's we on the council that provide that reality check, or whether they inform us of things that we ought to be doing that we can then help staff provide. I'd hope that it was really a creative role, and that the council wouldn't get into a control state. And I think, Councilmember Snipper, you're right. I wouldn't want to go to every meeting of every committee that I was assigned to as a liaison if that were the case. I wouldn't want to go to everyone. I'd want to go on occasion and say, what issues do you have, or what things do you wish were happening, and let me take them back and vet them and see if they have any legs. So I do like the idea of the liaison, whether it's staff or council. And I agree with you, Councilmember Barry, that time is an issue for staff people on evenings. They work here all day, and then we don't want to have to force them to go to a committee meeting every time there's a committee meeting, unless it's of value. So without going on anymore, I do think it's positive to have liaisons, but in a restrained way.
Okay, maybe we can, okay, one more general comment.
I realize that one of mine is sort of a general comment, so I'll put it in. I was wondering about, I'll call it member orientation and training.
Gay or straight?
That's pretty good.
Where's the training?
I'm not going to weigh in on that one, I can tell you that.
I'll weigh in on that one. The example's out in the atrium.
Okay. Yeah.
I thought they were mushrooms.
Oh, boy. Wow, wait. Okay.
Yes, I need some training.
Okay, on that note, we'll start at the beginning, and my sense is where appropriate, I'll just say any questions on this page. Where appropriate, we'll go to some specific items, and we'll try and make sure that we have specific direction for the clerk or the city manager or any of us to make notes for changes. And hopefully when we get to the end of this, because this is the only other item, this is the item for the rest of the agenda, we'll stay here till we're finished. And then we've dispensed with this, and we can get it out to the committees and staff for some review and go from here. So we'll start with, does anybody have any questions or comments on page 1, relationship and those issues that are laid out there? Sounds like page 1 is good.
Well, my first point might fit at the bottom of paragraph 1, where it talks about has the authority and committees have been established, but we might want to put something in there along the lines of it is the intent of the city to establish committees to further the city's priorities.
Any reactions, any comments? Yes, no? Councilmember Snipper.
The problem I have with that, I think focusing on the priorities is a great idea in general. I think that the committees, though, are so specific to a particular issue that the council is working on. It's hard to see how, they would do it. It's kind of operationally how it would play out. How would the nuclear-free zone fit in there? That's it. They have a very specific. They have these committees have a very specific mandate that they're, the land use committee or, pick your committee. They have a pretty specific charter mission. Hard to see how you'd be adding something that would shift as council priorities shifted every year. I guess say more about how it might work out.
Well, I think that the three, I hope I have them reasonably close. Service to community, sustainability, and my fiscal restraint probably is my own overlay on what that third one was. Can one of you help me out what our third priority was?
Sustainability, livability, and responsive government.
Responsive government is my service to community. Sustainability is clear, and responsive government. I substituted fiscal restraint for responsive government. That's my.
We all have our own lens through which we view the world.
Yeah. Pardon?
I said we all have our own lens through which we view the world.
Right. That is so true. But to answer Councilmember Snipper's question of where would, for example, the nuclear-free zone committee or the nuclear-free committee fit in, it seems to me sustainability would be a no-brainer. We want a sustainable world. We stand for a sustainable world. Nuclear-free zone, and that's what it's all about. I challenge you to come up with a committee that can't be put into one of these cubby holes. I can put them into any one into a
But
cubby.
then what's the purpose of having priorities if you can always fit something into the cubbyhole?
The purpose is, in this instance, is to make that connection, which we struggled with here just a few minutes ago, about getting them on board and giving them a sense of where they're going, and being able to have a conversation with the committee so that they're clear on what the expectations are, and giving us a kind of an outline to have a discussion with each of the committees. And if they can't fit inside the priorities which we discuss in light of what we feel our constituents' interests are, then I don't see a better way to outline a discussion.
Can I make a suggestion on how to incorporate that sense of getting them to focus on priorities? To say that we could insert some language here that says that the council would appreciate all of the committees keeping in mind the council priorities and providing feedback on any ways in which their work can further those priorities.
Say that again?
No. We're asking them to be aware of our priorities, discuss their work in the context of our priorities, and see if there's any ways that what they're doing can enhance our priorities, inform our priorities. And so they're aware of them, they know that they're going to change over time, and that they need to be aware of them in their discussions.
Right.
Councilmember Clay.
I wouldn't modify it to make the statement. I think that some of the committees that we have are, well, you could take any of them and fit them in the priorities, and in essence, we designed the terminology of the priorities that way so that they were broad and directional. But I think if you took something like the Montgomery College Neighbors Advisory Committee, I mean, you might fit that into any or all of the different priorities, but we have some of the committees are really designed to resolve more specific, localized issues. And so I think if you're going to say to them, the purpose and, the reason for being a committee is because you're going to help us forward these broad council priorities, that's not always the case. Sometimes we just want them to resolve a more finite program. And of course, everything that we do should ultimately fit into what our priorities are, especially as we have broadly defined them. But I don't think that we need to say that in this document, and I don't think we need to set up a situation where every committee, instead of doing this finite thing that we ask them to do, which is look at the Washington area land use issues or the specific health issues or the Montgomery County issues or, some of the others, we don't want them necessarily to think about their charge in terms, of this broader priority. We want them to stick to the specifics and not coming back to us all the time with, other mission things that they could do that'll help us with all these other broader priorities. We just want them to do the little thing that we ask them to do and come back and tell us about it, because I think they'll be more effective that way.
I agree. Did my language
Yes.
take it where you didn't want it to go?
No. I just had more to say about it.
Okay,
I hadn't said
okay.
anything yet tonight, so I thought I would share something.
Okay.
So what was your language again, Bruce?
Oh.
The committee should be aware of the priorities and work them in as they can.
Basically, yeah.
As appropriate.
As appropriate.
Yeah. And then we're not playing whack-a-mole and forcing them down into the particular hole.
I would add, though, on page 1, two more suggestions, and that is, anytime we see in this document the word recommendations, that it be preceded by the words specific and actionable. This gives us, this begins to help us help them be a bit more focused in their work, since I think the lack of focus and the tendency to generate laundry lists is pervasive. The other thing that we might also consider is anytime we see the word implementation, that we also find a place to add the words or the phrase based on available resources. That would go very neatly and at the very end of the last sentence of the last paragraph.
Time and resources permitting. That's the phrase of the federal government.
Right. Time and resources.
Anybody have any problems with those additions?
No, that sounds
Those
good.
are good. Any other comments on page 1? Councilmember,
I'm fine with the first thing that Councilmember Berry said. The second thing, because it's not the committee, it's actually the council providing directions to the city manager who's responsible for the implementation. So my assumption would be that if we were going to make a recommendation to the city manager, we would do that in the context of figuring out a way to pay for whatever it is we were recommending. We're asking her to do.
direction and resources to the city manager.
Yes, agree, but I think that as being mindful of the committee members and where they're coming from, to remind them to refrain from pie in the sky, and that everything that we do, is under some constraint about our resources, and I think it might create a more reasonable expectation on the part of the committee members about what we expect them to do, by reminding them often that there are these constraints and restrictions. And I don't think, based on some of the things, some of the reports that we've had, it almost seems like they feel their charge is to come up with everything under the sun, and we'll figure out a way to fund it. And I don't think that's not helpful to us in our deliberations.
I like Terry's suggestion that council provides direction and, what did you say, and resources to the city manager.
do we have consensus on that then?
Yeah.
Is that clear what we had, of what we consensed? Okay. End of page 1? Page 2. The committees, I heard one suggestion from Councilmember Siemens to acknowledge that the Emergency Preparedness Committee is not just an advisory committee, but I would suggest probably belongs more in the hybrid model. I'm not sure how that'll change anything, but I think it's an appropriate modification. Comments? That or any others? Councilmember Robinson is ready to go.
Yep. Hybrid is responsible for implementing a relevant section of the code, it says here. And I can see the Board of Elections and the facade advisory. There must be, I must admit that I'm not familiar with it, a section of our code which talks about being nuclear free.
Well, it's about purchasing, and they have to
Purchasing.
advise
There you go.
where there's something coming forward, they have a specific place in the process.
I knew that. And so emergency preparedness, is there such a, is there a portion in the code which addresses emergency preparedness?
I'll ask the city clerk to provide an answer to that, and depending on the answer to that, reaction to the change and any sense of how to accommodate it.
It is referenced in the code just in creating the committee. It doesn't deal with the specific code. It's not implementing any particular section of the code other than its creation as a committee to advise on emergency preparedness.
Do you have any reaction to the suggestion that the Emergency Preparedness Committee is different than the advisory committees?
In my opinion, I actually take minutes at those meetings, so I'm pretty familiar with it. They certainly consider themselves advisory to the council. There are city staff and others who sit on the committee, and they provide guidance to the suggestions to the staff, but they do report to the council. And in essence, as you'll recall, when they report to the council, sometimes what they're reporting on is the staff's progress on emergency preparedness.
Councilmember Siemens.
In a way, though, I think that what I see is different about that, other than a strict advisory committee, is that in some regards they're more of a staff supplement, that they actually perform tasks to get work done, to help the city staff in doing the emergency preparedness work. Again, I think if it's an advisory committee, then it seems that our other rules on staff liaison don't work because they have staff members who are actually co-chair of the committee. It's like it's either or, and I have argued in the past that that we shouldn't have staff members on the committee, but after looking more at the committee itself and how it functions, I see that it really isn't an advisory committee. It's they're really doing work and trying to help the city to get prepared, and it's work that is could certainly arguably be government work.
Can I suggest that if it's important to recognize that committee as a hybrid, we can just come up with some adjustment to the language about hybrid to accommodate it?
Yeah.
But is it the, so I just want to clarify, Terry, is it the issue that it's a city staff member on the committee, or, because a lot of committees ideally would be doing work that would further the mission of the city in that particular area, so maybe, I mean, I don't think they're out there putting bottled water into people's houses, they're probably helping to write the emergency preparedness plan, right, or help train people. The same could be said if the Committee on the Environment were working well, they would be writing a plan for how the city could be more environmentally responsible and maybe running workshops on how people get energy audits done or things like that.
Councilmember Clay.
What's the difference between a committee, a board, and a commission?
City code. There are no committees on the under quasi-judicial.
Yes.
They're
What's
boards.
the
boards.
difference between a commission and a board?
There are no boards under advisory committee. Only the hybrids have boards.
No, quasi-judicial has the noise control board and the personnel appeal board.
You're true, and the Arts and Humanities is a commission. Looks kind of like it's just words.
I think it depends on when the board, commission, or committee is established. The Nuclear Free Committee, I suspect, was established long ago, and I suspect it was meant to reflect its joint. Not only is it it's somewhat of an activist committee in addition to having that oversight function, and my guess is that's why it wasn't called a board or a commission.
Okay. The reason that I ask is because in some ways, like the structure doesn't quite fit in my head. It seems to me like commissions decide things. So like the Commission on Landlord-Tenant Affairs, Ethics Commissions, the Tree Commission, they all do these kind of judicial decision-making things. We're essentially delegating decision-making authority to them. The boards, like a board of directors, they run things. And so, you know, the board, like maybe the Arts and Humanities Commission would be a board, but they're engaged in that kind of business, running activities, and you know, the Public Safety Citizens Advisory Committee, they do outreach, and they have these tasks that they do, but they're not actually making decisions. And the committees have been there to provide information, feed information back to the council. And that's kind of more the way that I guess it's more the way that I think about them, or I think about the groups, is what are the groups that feed information back to the council? And that's their role. What are the groups that are ongoing, they have, you know, something that they run, and then what are the groups that are these judicial groups? And so it's hard for me to engage this conversation about the difference between an advisory committee and who's the staff member that's on them. I don't see the relevance in the same way.
Councilmember Sims.
I'll very quickly answer Councilmember Wright's question. I think it seems strange and inappropriate for the council to appoint an advisory committee and seek advice from a committee that is in any way controlled by a staff member. And I think that I agree that the Public Safety Citizens Advisory Committee and many of the other advisory committees are frequently engage in supplementing staff, but I think maybe that's where we have misused committees to a good degree in the past. And one of the things I think is we start to give clearer direction to the committees, we would do less of supplementing staff and more of seeking advice on the policies that we should be setting. We shouldn't be, we as a council shouldn't be doing the city government business. That should be the purview of the city manager. And if she needs volunteers to help her with that, and I strongly encourage the city manager to do that, that should not be through advisory committees.
Councilmember Rounds.
At the risk of going into heavy wordsmithing, I do appreciate, Colleen, your notion of what are these things. Research-based is something that comes to mind. Some things, we want some of our committees to do research for us and come back with suggestions or things that they find out that we don't have the reach to do, and that's outside our staff's purview or point of view. And seems to me that most of the committees, advisory committees, fall into that category. Then there are groups that implement things, like the Ethics Commission. We have a body of law, the ethics, part of the ethics code, and they review things and say, well, this fits here, and this works in this instance, or this adheres to this part of the ethics code, or doesn't in this other. And then there's the judicial that actually makes a decision, like the Tree Commission. Yes, you can do this. No, you can't do that. Now, the line there is a little hard to draw. Does that help?
Say the middle one again.
Implementing.
Right, okay. And I think one of the areas where we get into trouble, or at least where I always get uncomfortable, is when we have these advisory committees that start doing the liaisoning role, like where they start to essentially represent the council, and they become, they represent the city. So I'm frequently unhappy when we have a group that represents itself as the city's interest to the Washington Adventist Hospital, for example, and goes and asks them for money on behalf of the city when they haven't had a conversation with us about it. And so, I guess I would like to see us have some definitions and some kind of, maybe it's time to clean up the organizational structure and what we call them, and how what we call them really says what they do and what the limitations on that are. Does that make sense?
Yeah. The implement, can we, the one that you were confused with, I think is the stickiest one. The ones that actually implement something.
Yeah.
Facade advisory, is that a kind of an implementer committee?
Do they implement, or do they make decisions?
They implement a section of the code. Do they make decisions?
Do they say what you can put up and what you can't?
My sense is to make recommendations.
They recommend. But the COLTA makes decisions. They don't just recommend. They have the authority, the judicial authority, to say, this is how it's going to happen. So that's there's recommendations of implementation, and then there's actual judicial, and then there's the rest, research-based or something like that. Now, not one of those three has the authority to represent the city, or ought not. I agree with you. It ought not have the authority to represent the city's interests. Only interpreting what we've got and making a decision, or interpreting what we've got and making a recommendation, or doing broader research in one way or another and making recommendations. No?
Yeah.
I think all of these, none of these represent the city.
No, nor should they, because
Right.
Unless we pointed a negotiating team to go out and do something for us, which,
Well, but for example, the Health Services Impact Committee went and asked the Washington Adventist Hospital for money for a survey that we're doing, and I don't think they did that through the council, did they? They just went and did it.
right. Well, that's a good point. That we ought to say, perhaps we ought to say no, no
Maybe
asks.
that's not the way we as the city want to go and ask Washington Adventist for money. Maybe that's not what we would have put at the top of our list.
Maybe that's why they need orientation and training.
Yeah.
There you go.
That's right. So is it?
And maybe that's why it's good to have a staff liaison there who can catch that flag then.
But they had a staff liaison.
Well, mistakes get made, so.
Having sat on that committee at the time, but not having had an orientation, I think the understanding was that the committee chair was talking to staff liaison and the city staff about that, and also had some conversations directly with the mayor at the time. So I think there was some, not Bruce, but maybe the mayor wasn't coming back. Maybe the mayor wasn't functioning as a committee liaison person, sort of communicating back to the council.
Right, but we don't have a strong, we don't have a strong mayor form of government. We have a
The whole
council.
thing was not clear about what should be done.
So, is the sense of where we are on page 2 simple, or is it a whole lot more complicated and needs more stuff? Maybe the clerk can,
I was going to say, I could reword this a little bit and perhaps make it wasn't, really, it was just meant to be a list and give you
I
a
know.
general sense of what to do.
but it engendered a broader discussion than it was meant to.
So I can see, I can change, just based on what you talked about, I think I can rework it again so that it makes more sense.
Okay.
For someone looking at it.
And I'll recognize Councilmember Siemens if the first thing he says is okay.
Okay. The other point, though, that Councilmember Wright made, I think, is important, and that is maybe we need to have a rule in here or something in here on what are the limits or boundaries of what a committee can do, that they cannot represent city position without direction from the council, and they cannot solicit funds from other entities without approval of the council.
I think there can be some advisory language in there with some examples of the types of things to remember to do so that all of the representation of the city gets vetted through the council. Because I can think of other examples in the past as well. Okay, so comments from the city manager.
I was just going to mention, it may not be as broad as the council would like, but on page 8, there is included a section about lobbying, and I know what you're saying is maybe a little bit narrow, but it does talk about committees not lobbying or advocating without prior council approval.
Right,
So
right. And that gets at some of the previous issues.
Yes.
So the city clerk will circulate a revised sense of page 2, and if that's the only thing that's in that category, maybe we can just say that if it meets our needs and any comments back to the clerk, it will be added to everything else so that it can go out to the staff and the committees for their comments. We'll have a chance to still get at it when it comes back to us again, but what I don't want to do is have to come back and review page 2 before going on to the next step. Any difficulties with that?
No, but I would make a recommendation to put out to the committees the idea that we might want to clean up what we call them.
I think that could be part of however the clerk feels it most appropriate to provide that information.
Maybe later that we could just check with the city attorney, because it may be that board, given that it's in the code, board may actually be a legal term that means a certain thing in committee and commission, and maybe we should.
So we would like a little feedback, and there's a potential for some reconfiguration of how those names, what those names are used for and the implications for that. Page 3, definitions. Does anybody have any problem with definitions? Do those get at what we want to get at?
Yes.
So the thing that I noticed was the active member and the inactive member were of particular importance to me as I read it. Councilmember Barry.
Yes, one possible addition under council liaison would be in the second sentence after the phrase attend meetings, possibly add, for the purpose of facilitating communication between the council and the committee, but does not serve on the committee or actively participate in their deliberations. And then the second suggestion would be staff liaison, last sentence, there's a second period after committee, and this could say, a staff liaison does not work for the committee, and the liaison's participation is subject to other city priorities and serves at the city manager's discretion. You might add that.
Say that last sentence again.
Yes, and the liaison's participation is subject to other city priorities and serves, well, let's see, that doesn't make sense, does it? And the liaison serves at the city manager's discretion.
Does the city manager have any comments on that?
I think it's really more of an issue for the council to have discussions with the committees, quite frankly. I would say, from my perspective, this has probably been somewhat a source of contention with some of the committees where I think they're wanting, in some cases, lots of information with almost no notice, and there seems to be an expectation, which I think is what Councilmember Berry's trying to get to, that we're just going to drop everything and do it. And I think as Jesse and I were working on the relationship section, that's why we tried to talk about balancing it with day-to-day responsibilities, because I think that is an issue that both Jesse and I heard about quite a bit from certain members of the staff. I think the other issue, though, is during my almost 4 years here, there has certainly been some committees which I think have been perfectly fine with doing their own minutes and things of that nature. I would say equally there have been committee chairs that I'm familiar with who do not see that as a volunteer role and very much view that as an administrative support responsibility that should be borne by the city. We can obviously, we try to work with each committee on an individual basis, but I do think that's would be an issue that the council may want to talk about further at some point and really just clearly communicate what your direction is to the committees. That would be very helpful.
I would feel comfortable with saying that that's a committee role or a committee function, because I'm concerned with the amount of staff time because of the number of committees we have, the burden on the staff of doing that. I think it's a committee function. Maybe we should say that explicitly in it.
Yeah, I mean, I would say certainly I think there's been some committees where I think the staff's role is very helpful, because you don't want a committee kind of spinning their wheels, not knowing why something may not work, or we may already have the answer to the question. I would say, particularly with some of the planning staff, which I think all the council is aware of, has a pretty substantial workload, having Alana Blanchard or David Sewell or even Sarah Daines at times essentially almost being a reporting secretary to the committees is probably not the best use of their time.
Yeah, I agree. We wholeheartedly.
And maybe that could be in the bylaws that each committee has to have a chair and someone who serves the secretary function.
Yeah, I think I looked at Jesse for a minute, but I was just flipping through some of the ordinances or resolutions that have been adopted by the council, and in some cases it specifically talks about staff providing certain administrative support. So I think once we get a clearer sense of the council's direction, Jesse and I can certainly touch base and actually walk through some of the ordinances, because some of this may require a change in some enabling legislation as well.
And I'm thinking about the information that the council and staff have gotten from, for example, some of the open meetings sessions at various MML functions. And the lesson I've taken away from that as far as minutes is that I think in many cases people keep minutes that are entirely too detailed for what's necessary In the case of our council minutes, all you're required to do is note any actions taken and, the vote or whatever it is, but you don't have to say, council member such and such said such and such, and the next person said such and such. You can just say, this was discussed, these were the highlights, and here's the action taken. So I think for the committees, if they recognize that they don't have to, the recording secretary doesn't have to sit there and take 5 pages of notes for an hour-and-a-half meeting, that they probably won't be reluctant to take on that responsibility.
The sentence before the one that you suggested change for, Doug, it kind of takes the opposing position. The staff liaison, it could be read in that way. The staff liaison provides administrative and technical support to assist the committee in setting its agenda and fulfilling its mission. Could, to me, be easily interpreted as, oh, good, a note taker.
Yeah, I would strongly urge us not to continue providing that service.
Well, how do we change this sentence, or do you think we need to change
Strike
it?
the sentence.
Or strike administrative. I mean,
Just get rid of administrative. Technical support is, I think, appropriate for
Right.
them because it draws on their expertise.
Okay, so can we do that? Just strike administrative?
Administrative, yeah.
Any frowns from either end of the dais?
No. I do think that we should let the city manager or city clerk go through each committee and see if that's really true for every committee.
And obviously, they need some administrative support. They need
That's
to
true.
have somebody's copy before the meeting. They need something.
Yeah, I think what I would suggest is, I think Jesse and I both have a pretty clear sense of where you want staff time devoted and where you don't, and if you would let us maybe talk a little bit, and perhaps we can come back with kind of a rewording of this section to make sure that the staff is doing what is appropriate in support of the committees, but not spending time where the council doesn't want us to.
Okay.
Okay, that sounds good. Because I would note that the part that I did like in there was to assist the committee in setting its agenda and fulfilling its mission.
Right.
Because I thought that addresses the concern that Councilmember Siemens had about staff setting an agenda.
Is there a definition requirement for non-voting member? For example, right now with the Recreation Committee, because there were so many people that wanted to volunteer, I think Howard's not actually a voting member of the committee. And I guess any resident can go to a committee meeting anytime they want to. So maybe we don't need non-voting member as a designation, but that was just something that came to my mind.
Where is non-voting member in?
It's not there.
on here.
Okay.
But they do exist in some cases, but maybe that's just handled by the fact that any resident can go to a committee meeting anytime they want and make comments, but not vote.
Right. Okay. Anything else on definitions on page 3? Okay, then let's take a break, and we'll come back. I'm always going for multiples, 5s and 0s on the time back, but we'll come back at 9:22 on that clock. Because we got more to do.
Why did you say 9?
Because clarify this. We've had some discussion already. Councilmember Wright, did you want to say anything about this one? Either recap your previous comments or whatever else.
I guess one of the points I would make is that I've heard from constituents, not a lot of them, but a few who care about this in particular, is that you pay more taxes to be in Tacoma Park, be part of the city, and it seems odd that people can be on committees, make recommendations to the city, particularly around issues that are very relevant to a neighborhood, or might have a say in how, in the case of the Arts and Humanities Commission, how resources are spent, and that you don't necessarily have to be a resident of the city to do that, based on how commissions, de facto of how they've been handled, because there are a fair number of people who don't meet the residency requirement. So I'm not sure quite how we do it, but it does seem like there should be some rule, some more hard and fast rule or system to decide about whether people are in or out based on residency. I don't know what that is.
Because I guess if I can go back to one or two instances I know of where exceptions were made to specifically include non-residents. The one that I always remember is the Public Safety Committee, where there was a concern about having people on there who represented businesses, and owners of businesses didn't necessarily reside in the city, so then it was some language that I think I saw in here about, reside in the city, own a business in the city, or, have a particular reason for a tie to the city. So that I think there were efforts to get beyond only residents.
I think the reside in the city, have a business in the city. You might also want to put or work in the city. Or own property in the city.
Yeah, because in the case of Colta, that's landlords.
Right.
And so you start getting into all of these various.
But I think that those, for the two examples that Councilmember Wright gave, or at least two of the examples, don't really fit neatly in there. The Arts and Humanities Commission is one that's making recommendations to this council on how resources should be spent. And the other one is a group that addresses neighborhood issues, including non-city residents, because they are in the same neighborhood. And I'm not suggesting a change, I'm just saying I don't think that what we've crafted addresses those issues.
And I think that I recognize that in the case of Micmac, where there are people, residents who don't reside in the city, I feel like it's valid to have them there because they're immediate neighbors of the college, and the issues are for the in the kinds of things that the neighborhood is concerned about. They're affected as much as anybody else, and wanting to have their input.
Does it make sense to have the committee use its discretion in this regard to some extent, or does that not wash?
Well, it depends on who we give them as to who the committee is.
No, because I think then we start to get friends and family from around the area joining committees because the committee likes them.
I mean, I guess I don't quite understand. We have just a small number of committees, and it seems well justified as to why you would have waived the residency requirement.
Do you think we could articulate those things in a list of reasons why we would waive the residency requirement, or do you see there
like guidelines, you mean?
Yeah, or do you think there's some things? I could also understand that we might think that there's some things that are unforeseen that we hadn't thought of, and we might not be able to let.
And wasn't there also something in here, I don't remember where, but there was something about essentially that council can kind of give preference to residents. Oh, is it under the options on page 2 of the committee membership thing, establishing evaluation criteria when be choosing between residents and non-residents, select residents. So that that was a potential thing to add, just to note that there are reasons to have non-residents, but certainly that kind of, I'll throw my Latin term out there, ceteris paribus, everything else being equal, all other things being equal. I'm not a Latin scholar, but that's close enough, that give preference to city residents.
Yeah, and just thinking of another exception, I think on the Emergency Preparedness Committee, there are government representatives from Montgomery County on the committee that, again, are not city residents. And I state that with no opinion on whether that's good or bad.
Yeah, and I think with the Arts and Humanities Commission, I can't say that I quite remember why it was set up the way it was, but I think that getting the input from people who have a tie to the city, who don't live here, has been very helpful. And if we were to do something like, say, well, only city residents on the Arts and Humanities Commission, we'd lose a lot of valuable members of that committee, including, I think, the chair and a vice chair. So I don't particularly want to get wrapped around an axle about requiring city residency for a committee. I think
I'd like to
if we
get more information on how many we're really talking about.
well, do we have it here? With this,
Aren't we those setting a general policy? We shouldn't be doing specifics, really. Because then it doesn't,
Right.
what happens next year? We're going to set another
Point well
specific set
taken.
of policy.
I guess a related issue, if we go with something broad that basically says council has discretion to waive this requirement based on needs as it sees fit. If I recall, one of my constituents, and I read the city ordinance or code at one point, it does seem like there's the potential for some conflict there. There's some view that it's actually a requirement for statutory committees. So if that's the case, we should just make sure that legally that language is clear.
maybe we can just get any advice back from city manager or the clerk to make sure that there aren't those conflicts, and that I don't necessarily hear anybody saying that we should undo what we've already got, and just I think it's a question of what general language we want to add. Councilmember Clay.
I would say, as a general principle, if we're going to have people who are going to vote on the expenditure of city monies, essentially, that they should be city residents. If we're going to, the Arts and Humanities Commission, I think, is a good example of that. If we're going to spend city tax dollars, then yeah, I think that they should be city residents. Like, I understand why in McNack you want, other folks, and the Health Services Impact Committee had a broader jurisdiction, and I think it's good as a city to be a good, a good municipal citizen in that sense, and look at including people where there are broader issues. But I mean, if it's really a defined city issue, like where are we going to put up art in the city and how are we going to spend the tax dollars to do that, I would prefer that be primarily made by our.
And I could see agreeing with that, but I also think about instances where we have people who are, I'm not sure it would come up in the context of Colta making a recommendation, but the example I'm thinking of is Colta has landlords who aren't residents of the city but own buildings in the city, and therefore it's the landlord who's paying the tax technically to the city. Therefore, they would not be a resident, but they would be a taxpayer, just as a business owner would be a taxpayer. So I think if we could say something like, if it was recommendation for spending city tax dollars, what we want to know is what was the support for that among those who pay city taxes on the committee?
I would agree with that, that in some instances that being a business owner would be a legitimate reason to put somebody on the committee. And facade advisory board, where there's a relationship between the business ownership and the actions of the committee, I would totally.
And therefore, in any recommendation that committee would make, it would be those who have a fiscal stake in the recommendation who get the kind of the weighted vote of making that recommendation. So you could still have people who were on the committee who, for in a particular instance, might not fit the reason to vote on that recommendation, but we would just say we want to know what the vote is of the people who fit that criteria. Councilmember Sanders.
Thank you. I hear two issues on the table. One is, committee members, what qualifies for being a Tacoma Park person to have on the committee. And I think we said residing in Tacoma Park, having a business in Tacoma Park, or being a landowner in Tacoma Park. And I think that covers the other one, which you mentioned, which is being a taxpayer in Tacoma Park. And I think those are all legitimate. I think the other issue on the table, though, is those people who do not fit any of those qualifications, and I would support Councilmember Clay's position on that.
I do too. I just want to make sure we didn't exclude the other one.
I do worry about taxpayer because somebody who stays in the hotel pays a hotel tax. Are they a
Drop taxpayer then?
Just like the, whatever they call them in the paper today for the people who buy the cup of coffee at Dulles Airport and go on the access road.
Did you include in your list people who work here, Terry?
No, I didn't, but I'm certainly open to that, yes.
They're contributing.
That work here, meaning for any Tacoma Park business, or here for the Tacoma Park city government?
Any Tacoma Park business. The sweat of their brow falls on our
And then all of a sudden we get the person who cuts the lawn, who comes in one time and cuts their lawn and says, I work in Tacoma Park. Or I, as a contractor, could say, I occasionally get a job in Tacoma Park, that, if I didn't have any other qualification. We start getting into a whole bunch of little hair splitting.
I think a general live in Tacoma Park is a good general guideline. And then for specific committees, we would have a discussion about what's the most appropriate person or, kind of person.
And I think most of those discussions have taken place in setting up the committees.
Right.
And therefore, they're already established.
Yep.
The city manager is looking thoughtful.
Well, no, I was thinking when you were talking, Mayor, about someone working in the city. For instance, some of the culture reps could be property managers. They don't own the apartment building, therefore they're not a taxpayer. But part of the whole idea of CULTA is to have not only essentially tenant participation, but also the perspective of those who are landlords in some way. I think similarly you may have someone, I was trying to flip through some of the committees, and Jesse may need to help me out, but in some cases you may have someone who is not technically the owner of a business in Old Town, but may be someone who rents space and is essentially a business operator or owner, but they're not actually the taxpayer who owns the property. So I guess I'm just trying to think through what's the nexus to the city as the council talks through this issue. I guess my own feeling is there may be some opportunities that if you're too strict on the kind of the property owner, we may be shutting out some people who may actually have something very valuable to add.
So maybe you have enough information, you can make some suggestions for next time when that comes back?
Yeah, some of these, I think as I flip through those who have non-resident participation, I guess I can think of a reason why, and some of them, as the mayor was alluding to, there's certainly some very qualified non-residents on arts and humanities, but I wasn't here at the time the committee was formed, so I don't know what the thinking was.
And I'm not sure I remember what the thinking was, but...
Certainly Sarah Danes could probably help, but...
Just the legal conflict point I was talking about, I think, is if you go to this, the second packet, which is the committee membership packet, you go to page 6 under section B at the beginning, it says, except as otherwise provided in sections specific to individual committees, all members of committees are residents of the city of Tacoma Park. And in the event that a committee member ceases to reside in Tacoma Park, the member is ineligible to serve on the committee as an active member. So I think there are cases where there aren't specific sections that specify that you could have a non-resident in the ordinance related to the committee, but we have them. So I think that's the conflict that some of my constituents have pointed out to me. So we have to just rectify that legally and come back with language that has that council broad authority superseding, authority to grant non-residency committee memberships.
I think I'll ask at this point if the city clerk and the city manager feel like they've captured the discussion and can come back with some language that fits the concerns. Unanimous yes. Anybody have any other issues with that, so we can move on?
Are we still on page 4?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Any other issues on page 4?
Yes, a couple of others. One, we might add under the application section that committee vacancies will be regularly posted in the city newsletter, on the website, and through other communication channels.
That's true. That is what they tend to do now, but it's not necessarily what they.
And I think we need to, do it regularly and vigorously to make sure that people know these things exist. And I know that we have carried them in the past, and on occasion in the newsletter I've seen them there. But I think by formalizing it here in this document, we'll make sure that all those different touch points are included as a matter of course. The other, I guess the other question or the issue I'd like to bring up, because I know we have been twitted for it in the past, and that is, do we absolutely need to have people come before us for these interviews? Or can we change that approach so that folks can submit to us in writing their applications, which would be standardized, asking all the questions, but not so laborious that they'll never want to fill it out. And then we can deal with them from the dais here without necessarily having to go through this laborious week after week process, and instead save that time and be able to have more meaningful discussions on policy-related matters.
Aye.
I also have heard from a number of people that they view the interview, why do we interview? Because it's sort of a joke. It's not taken seriously in the sense that it doesn't really matter what the person says, they get approved. If they don't get approved, it's not because of something they've said in the interview, it's because of other knowledge by council members outside of that.
If I can...
Always been true.
Yeah, that hasn't always been true, and I'm thinking that we currently have more than the maximum number that we've interviewed for the WA Land Use Committee, and we need to have some criteria for choosing who we want to appoint. In general, I agree with the point that a lot of the interviewing has become fairly pro forma, but I can foresee where in this instance, and we could have had the question with the Recreation Committee where we had more people, but the former chair stepped aside, that we have needed to have a little something more to go on. Councilmember Singh.
I would just like to make the observation that the county government seems to be able to appoint board, commission, and committee members without going through individual interviews, and they do a fine job. I think we could probably find a way. We could also leave it to our discretion on there's certain circumstances where we may want to talk to a person, but it doesn't have to be everybody every time.
I think, though, on a lot of those commissions at the county level, it's not the county council interviewing, but frequently there's some combination of staff and/or committee members who interview. So I don't.
That may be the solution.
Councilmember Snipper and then Councilmember Robinson.
I also think that we should add input from the committees about the applicants.
Well, there was some other section that talked about.
Yes, that was
some of
one of
this.
that was one of the options.
Where was that? Was that the committee membership?
It's under appointments, application process.
There's something under committee vacancies on page 5, Mayor. I don't know if that's what you're looking,
Yeah, maybe.
the section you're looking for.
Page 5 of which one?
I'm sorry, the very first document in your packet.
Okay.
Attached to the blue sheet.
Yeah.
The May interview?
No, I forgot where, but it has come up, and I have it in my notes as something to do. I don't remember where I actually saw it, but.
We could ask them.
Oh, here it is, yeah, in the second document, top of page 5, the option to, instead of interviewing, have the council member liaison or the ward council member pre-screen the applicant.
Yeah, that's the thought, too.
I kind of liked that option.
Which one?
Of either council liaison or the ward council member.
It's the hybrid model.
That way, there's some sense from council member, and therefore, if we need input for instance, weeding out to get down from the larger number than we have available, we've got some information to go on, other than just whatever they put down on a piece of paper. Councilmember Robinson.
And that's an excellent suggestion, because I think the interview process is a useful thing, but I agree that maybe having the whole council, the interviewer, is pretty time consuming.
Yeah, I agree too. That's where I was headed. Is I like to see people up there because I feel like I get to know them a little bit. But if one of us knowing, then we can certainly have a discussion amongst the rest of us. And having the interplay between one of us as staff, or as council liaison, and somebody on the committee is even better, because then they feel included.
So, is there agreement that we would, instead of having full council interview people, we would have either a liaison, if there is one, or the ward council member kind of essentially do the interview?
Yeah.
Okay, got that one taken care of.
Amazing.
If I can address a concern I've got back to page 4, behind the blue sheet, the application, the 4th paragraph in that section. It says that the staff confirms that applicants are current on city stormwater fees and do not owe more than $10 in city library fines. And when I read that, I added to make it that applicants are current on city taxes and stormwater fees and don't owe library fines.
Yeah.
I wondered where the $10 came from. And
Well,
taxes
Taylor
is the most
Porter.
important piece.
Jesse's smiling. I'm going to go out on a limb here. My guess is that, do you want to disqualify someone who maybe owes 25 cents as a library fine? Is that where it came from? That it was some more substantive amount where they've essentially stolen a book by not paying?
The library itself, that's the point at which they, I guess, don't let you check out additional books if you owe that much. That's their cutoff point for, and so in conversations with the library director, that was her suggestion, to use the same cutoff.
Well, but my reaction is we want to know that they're current on their obligations. And owing $10 in library fines is not current on their obligations.
But at the state, if you forget to pay your taxes or don't pay your taxes, they say you're not in good standing as a corporate entity. So maybe we can have some language like that they're in good standing, and leave it to the discretion of the librarian if the librarian changes the fine, the cutoff from $10 to $20, then we know. No?
I'm happy to just say everything's paid.
Yeah, pay your library
Yeah.
fine. $10.
Sorry, what'd you say?
It's $10, pay your library fine.
Yeah.
What
I mean,
what
it's
if you're
simple.
having, on the taxes, what if you're having some kind of dispute or whatever, and technically you owe, but you have it in, I mean, you could get into some weird stuff with taxes.
Settle the dispute.
Yeah.
Well, I'll give you an example. I got a note from Maryland saying I owed, I don't know, $10,000 or $12,000 one year, and they said, here's the telephone number. I called them up, and it turned out that my estimated tax payments had been entered with the wrong Social Security number, so all of my estimated tax payments had not been credited to my account, but to somebody else's. And, you know, it was handled in a few, it was delightful. It was actually handled in a few minutes over the phone. And, you know, a couple weeks later, I got a little note saying, here's your corrected thing. But for a period of time, I was a tax delinquent in Maryland.
We always knew that about you.
I'm sure it'll come up in my next campaign that you know, my opponent will, could you reelect that tax dog?
I guess I'd rather just say that they're current on everything, and if there's an extenuating circumstance, we can know that and say, you know, in an instance like that, if it was dragging on, that we can deal with it. But I just hate setting it up for, you know, well, you're good on this thing and not on the other thing, and it just seems
So
like
you're bouncing for a quarter then?
Yes.
Yep.
Yep.
Boy.
Yep. There have to be standards in this world.
They can come up to speed and then go back. Then
What
slack
was
back.
yesterday's quarter?
I'm okay with that language.
I actually like Dan's language about some kind of just current or whatever, and that the city staff are given some discretion.
Okay,
to
how
say-
about current or in good, current or in good standing?
I don't like discretion. I like just deferring to city staff recommendation on this. For the library, if it's $10, that might not be the number I would have picked, but if that's their choice.
Yeah, but if they want to be on a city committee, they pay their library fee.
I'm going to ask Jesse here. I think when something, I can think of at least one instance where someone had applied, we checked, I believe it was a stormwater fee that had not been paid. My understanding, and Jesse can either nod or shake her head no, is that the clerk's office notified the applicant that their name would not be moving forward, and the individual came in and paid the stormwater fee, or if that's what it was, and basically became in good standing. Obviously, in a situation like Councilmember Snippers, that's a whole different ballgame, but these were fairly easy problems to resolve, most of the ones that I can think of. Is that right?
I agree with all those.
It's a compliance measure.
It's just the library fines, those tend to come and go frequently as people forget to bring a book back, they bring it back. You know, you don't want to be bouncing somebody for the quarter they didn't even get the notice on yesterday.
I think in terms of this amount, there's some point at the library where you're withheld from checking out books. And before that, I think my sense was that the library staff, it was cumbersome to be looking for people who owe the quarter, but that they have a list of people who owe $10 or more.
We should publish it in the newsletter.
Ah, now
That's always been my wish.
That's a different issue. I could support that.
I always wanted to publish the tax scofflaws in the newspaper.
This is your point, Bruce. How are we going to resolve it?
Perhaps what we could do is check with, I know Ellen is out of town, I think, until Wednesday or out of the office. my sense is the council wants to have as much compliance by people applying to be on boards and commissions, but not create an undue burden and make sure that we can actually verify that someone is in fact delinquent. So since we're going to be bringing some issues back with the council's indulgence, maybe we could talk to Ellen and find out exactly whether or not it is problematic to flag amounts that are smaller.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah, if it becomes too burdensome on staff to see if they owe $5 rather than the $10, you know, I'll give up on that as long as the taxes get in there. Other questions on page 4?
The representative member is one of the issues that we should talk about. So the two components there are what organizations get to decide. So does Safe Tacoma start to say, well, we want someone on the public safety committee, and does someone form a marijuana group, legalization of marijuana, and they want someone on the committee as their, does Sustainable Tacoma want to be on certain committees when they, so what's the rules by which someone, is that just something the council decides when they draft the ordinance about who gets to appoint somebody on, what organizations get to appoint someone on the committee?
I guess I would say that my sense of the way it has worked has been that I think generally at the time the ordinance is put forward creating a committee, there have been arguments in favor of a particular organization having a reason to have representation on there. I'm not sure that there has been discussion about adding ones when somebody comes up at a later point and saying, gee, I think we need an institutional representative on something. But I think in either of those cases, it's been the council deciding. And the particular reasons depend on the particular circumstances of the committee. Is there something other than the council deciding that we need to discuss?
If that's the way we want to do it, I mean, I'm okay with that, I guess.
Any input from anybody on that? Councilmember Clay.
Well, I've gotten feedback from folks from different organizations that if there are other folks who are, well, I think what we're reaching is a kind of a threshold maybe in the city, and we've got this issue going on in a couple of places, and one is on committee placement, and the other one is on how we dole out these little bits of money. So we've got these long-standing organizations, and they've participated in city committees, and they've always come to the city, and they've always gotten, this little bit of money or that little bit of money. And we are fortunate, and we have a lot of emerging civic engagement, and we have more of those organizations competing for money and interested in, especially these kinds of committees that decide what kind of projects the city engages in and how we spend money. And so, yeah, I hear more comment from folks from groups that maybe aren't as long-standing but have been around now for a while, or emerging groups about, how they get a piece of that pie. So, I think we should talk about it. I'm starting to feel some pressure around that from folks.
Is that from, it reminded me when you brought that up about the discussion that we still need to have about money to nonprofits. Is this from groups that are not with nonprofit status, but I would say lesser organizational structure, looking for help in that way or having concerns about?
I've thought about whether or not they have nonprofit status or not. In terms of the committee, it's civic association groups. So I guess a couple of them have nonprofit status and a couple of them don't.
I think of the Tacoma Park Community Action Group as an example,
Yeah, that would be a good
They want,
example.
they want to know how they can get a piece of the pie.
But that's, I mean, one thing is the question of them getting money, is we should have a process.
Right.
Of how we build up
And we're
the
going to have
money.
that discussion.
But have you also been hearing about how they get seats on committees?
Yes.
Okay.
And the only reason why I brought up the money part is just I think that it's related to this issue that we have more and more organizations who are active and participating. So I think we've all seen it coming to the council and the money issue, but I've also heard from people about the committee participation and being active and engaged in the committees. And, you know, my personal opinion is that with relatively few exceptions, there is ample opportunity to participate in the committees. I'm not sure we have to, on our committees, be designating space for particular entities. You know. I don't think there's as much competition for that at this point as there is for I think it's a bigger issue in the financial arena than it is at this point in the committee arena.
It is a tough issue, because you can imagine, suppose we did a hypothetical, we had some nationally well-known environmental group that was, you know, headquartered in Tacoma Park, and it had a whole staff of experts on this, that, or the other thing. The city would want to draw on that expertise for free, of course.
Sure.
So it's easy to imagine a council saying, I would really like to hold a seat for that organization on the Environment Committee, for example.
But we get to pick who's on the committees. How about, let's think about an organization that actually hasn't said anything. How about True Vote? True Vote is a national organization that's here. Do we hold a spot for them on our Board of Elections? Yeah, I don't think so. And they're not one of the people who's contacted me, that's why I picked them.
I gathered that, too.
Or even a more local group like the Tacoma, they haven't contacted me about this either, but the Tacoma Park Green Building Group. Theoretically, they could be saying, I think we should have a seat on the Committee on the Environment. It may not be at this point for particular reasons, but it could be. Is that, you know, do we just sit down as the council? Do they have a process where they ask for that, and then we say yes or no? Just what is the...
All right, so...
And I guess currently we would say, well, if you have individuals who are interested, have them apply, and if there's a spot, we'll put them on.
But why don't we say that to the other
Yeah, why don't we say that to...
Well,
and I'm not picking on Historic
that
Tacoma,
leads to
but
that,
yeah,
yes.
right. Like, then why don't we say to Historic Tacoma, if you want a seat on the Facade Advisory Board, apply as an individual,
And I guess they would say it's because they provide the expertise and the liaison to the County Historic Preservation Commission, which has say over what happens on the facades in the Historic Commission, in the Historic District.
that's been, and I don't want Historic Tacoma to think I'm picking on them, I'm just going through the logic here.
Oh, go ahead.
That's a self-appointed liaison position. We haven't, city staff hasn't asked them to necessarily do that. City council hasn't asked them to do that. It's helpful to the city. I'm glad they do it in most cases, but we haven't asked them to do that. So it's sort of a self-appointed position. So an organization appoints themselves to be a liaison about something else. Does that then entitle them to get onto a commission?
And I think the real question is where is the line drawn? You know, a lot of these with Historic Tacoma make sense. You know, what about Safe Tacoma? You know, some of the other committees. Should they have a reserved seat, or you know, should they just, the members, if they want to apply to it? That's the question. I don't know.
I've been mulling this over for a while, and I've come to the conclusion that a corporate entity, whether it's nonprofit or for-profit, ought not have a designated seat on a committee. And if somebody from Safe Tacoma wants to be on public safety, then I'm with you, Bruce. Let them apply. And furthermore, since we talked earlier about the committee members, chairs ostensibly, and one of us as the council liaison having discussions about who would be good on the committee, then that's the time, if the committee chair says, we really need somebody from Safe Tacoma, or if one of us says, we really ought to have somebody from Safe Tacoma because they bring a certain amount of expertise, then I'm thinking that person can apply and serve individually. It's become I'm hard to convince now that a corporate entity on a committee is a good idea.
I do wonder how that would apply to, say, the Emergency Preparedness Committee, or even COLTA, which has, but anyway, it seems to me that committees that do coordination, you'd want the representative from the bodies that you're coordinating with.
Right. I guess it's the definition of coordination. Facade. You want the opinion of Historic Tacoma, but you can always get it. What was the one you just mentioned?
Emergency Preparedness comes to mind.
And who would be the corporate body that you'd want to have a permanent seat?
Well, currently, the hospital, the volunteer fire department, county department of Homeland Security, although there isn't a Department of Homeland Security anymore.
It seems to me that it's dependent on the sort of mission and charter and what the council wants out of the committee.
Maybe, I'm wondering if a possible thing here is to say that we're not quite sure where we are on this one, and that I have a feeling no matter what we say, we're going to get a lot of comment back from certain organizations.
Yep.
And therefore, we might as well just say, where we're, oh, great, that would help. So what?
We don't know.
No way.
He said, no way.
Go away.
Oh, is it go away or no way?
No way. No. But it doesn't matter.
Is because the next step in this process is going to be to send this out to the committees for comment. So no matter how we send it out, we're going to get that comment back. So I think at this point, we're not quite sure where we are on that one, and we'll get the comment back, and then we'll decide where we want to go.
And I would just suggest that the Emergency Preparedness Committee is enough of an anomaly that it not even fall under these rules.
Which goes back to your original point.
Right.
Yeah, I would just say from the staff's perspective, the whole goal of the Emergency Preparedness Committee is to make sure that we have well-integrated systems, and since Montgomery County is essentially the lead agency, and if we truly had a wide-scale emergency, at least as long as Washington Adventist is here, they would play a critical role. I think the work of the committee would be seriously impeded if we did not have this institutional
I think the committee is great. It does good work. I think it's a staff function, and I'm glad that we have community members that want to participate on it.
So is my proposal for that section satisfactory?
Maybe we could just have in that section some comments about what we're struggling with.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. Now we're on page 5. Anybody got any issues with terms? Committee terms.
We talked about terms of chairs. I think Councilmember Berry brought that up.
Yeah, I thought that was good.
Yeah.
Suggestion.
I also think we should at least have a guidance, if not a requirement, that people rotate off a committee after some period of time. It's partly a burnout issue, but it's partly to encourage new blood. Even if it's as simple as some longtime person, picks their replacement, at least it's somebody different. I do think.
For a
that
maximum of 2 consecutive terms?
figure out something, maximum of a couple of terms, some maximum anyway.
And of course, if we get down to, say, for instance, maximum of 2 terms, then we get back over to some committees have terms of 3 years and some have 2 years.
Yeah, there's,
And is there a reason for it to be 2 years and should it be 3?
some are 1 year, because,
My suggestion was 2 consecutive terms,
Right.
allowing someone to be off for a term and then back on.
Which
And
we
the other
currently
thing
have
might
with
be,
some.
and the other way to do it might be a maximum of 6 years, consecutive years, and that would take care of the different lengths of terms.
Maybe just people need to have their head examined if they're on a committee for 6 years.
So we want
Well, it is, there, on the other hand, I'll give the both sides of it. There are some committees that we've had a hard time staffing, and then, so people stay on them for a long time because of that. But that may be the cause, because that's why I wondered if maybe a guideline thing might be. Because then, if there were a guideline, we could bring it up. When it was the 4th term for this particular person, we could say, we have this guideline, we're wondering whether.
And then it would be, yeah, and then
And then
point
we
on
go
it.
on, okay. Yeah, you're probably right.
Again, discretion.
So it sounds like we want to propose getting feedback from the committees on both chair term limits and appointment limits. And that we will come to some kind of conclusion with that as we bring this whole discussion to conclusion after we get the feedback from the committees and staff. And we'll remember this discussion that we had and not spend half an hour on any one issue again.
If we're asking, this is probably another issue we're not going to resolve tonight, but we want feedback from the committee is, once a organization has the right to have a member on its committee, what's the process? I feel like there should be a uniform process around that. Right now, in some cases, it's the other committee or organization just chooses the person. Should there be an approval of the council? Some of them just...
I thought they all came before the council.
Not all.
Not all? No.
Okay. Is he allowed to go back and pay?
No, I just want to make sure that should be also something we want. I don't think we're going to solve it tonight, and I know it's getting late, but we should ask for their feedback on it.
Okay. Attendance requirements. My only note here at the end of it was, gee, do we need to tighten this up and be a little bit more proactive in what happens rather than just kind of the council was notified. If the committee member continues to fail to attend, the council is notified, and then they're deemed to have resigned, or should there be something else going out that says, is the way it's written here, or the way it might currently be done in some instances, is there some communication that goes out from the city that says, you failed to meet whatever the requirements are, therefore, you need to respond, and if you don't respond, you're off?
It is an informal process for the most part, and one of my goals in writing it this way or making this one option is so that it doesn't require an affirmative action of the committee or the council to remove a member. I'd rather it just
happen.
to have resigned if they fail to meet the attendance requirements.
Right. I know the county has their policy in this is that they do give the individual the opportunity to send in a letter of explanation saying that they do want to continue on the committee if they've failed to meet or if they've passed the criteria for being bumped off. So that's maybe something to add here.
It seems like the wording here could encompass that, if the city clerk sent a letter notifying them of the attendance requirements, that's kind of notice that, hey, you're not complying, so. And then it goes on if the member continues to fail to attend. So it seems like that's covered in this wording.
The other intention, this may not be the best way to do it, but this has the committees themselves writing the attendance requirements.
Yes.
If the group comes to an agreement on what the attendance requirements need to be, and then it would automatically trigger based on
Right.
the criteria they set.
Okay.
And the chair shall report the names who do not meet the minimum attendance. It's a shall, right? So they have the responsibility for setting the requirements, then they also have a responsibility for reporting. And then you have the responsibility for sending a letter, and then you have some discretion about when they're really off, and that can certainly be in after conversation with the chairs of the committee. So it gives a certain amount of leeway, but I think it's good, personally.
And after hearing these comments in response to my concern, I withdraw my concern. I'm happy. Anybody else have any comments on the attendance requirements? Vacancies. Any questions there?
Well, we would just want the language here to parallel the language, excuse me, the language that Councilmember Berry proposed for the beginning, which essentially highlighted the more repetitive, vacancies are a bit of a drumbeat, I guess, is the orientation Councilmember Berry had.
Okay. Any other comments? We're now on the, I'll call it the last page, even though there's a little squib on 7. Ethics and conflicts of interest. Any questions there?
I don't have a question, but I think if we do an orientation, this needs to be part of it. Maybe it's done, maybe there's more formal orientation done with like the facade advisory board, but do people know if it's their facade, if they're a landlord and it's their facade that's being reviewed, they really shouldn't vote on it? I mean, is that something that's known or people are trained on? Seems like it should be part of it.
That's why they got on the committee.
And I'm assuming the orientation is going to be committee by committee and possibly provided by the liaison and possibly provided by somebody else, rather than all committee members come to one orientation? Or is it going to be covered as everybody comes to one?
I think it depends on the issue. I would say generally when someone joins the committee, I think the staff liaison will, working in conjunction with the clerk's office, will make sure they get a copy of whatever the enabling legislation is. If there's bylaws, they're provided that. I think the only time, Jesse, we've done somewhat committee-wide orientation. Everyone was at least encouraged to send one representative, was what you did a year or two ago on the Open Meetings Act. And we didn't require every single board and commission member, but we did ask each group to send at least one representative.
Maybe it's a general committee members handbook.
Right, we could do that.
And book is used very loosely.
That's a good idea.
Okay. Any other questions on that section? The annual review, I feel like we've had some discussion there, and it's going to be, yes, there's at least annually, but we're going to try and come up with some additional ways to get correspondence and feedback back and forth so that we're going to be encouraging a little closer coordination with the committees and various ways to have them get discussions with us about what their priorities are and what their issues are. Meetings?
back to Councilmember Berry's suggestion that notification be made not only for vacancies, but also for meeting times and schedules in the newsletter and the website and other media outlet.
And I like the idea of trying to arrange for like an annual schedule so that people know.
Could we, as part of the annual report or the annual review, ask for a status of, when did they meet in the past year? Just a list.
I think we could have a checklist of various things that need to be in the report.
Addressed, yeah.
And that's a good place for any of their comments about how their work has tied into the priorities.
Right.
And any wrap-up of issues about, attendance bylaws, any of that stuff. There can just be a whole checklist of things that, as appropriate, they need to cover in that report. And then the substance of the report is going to be different in different cases, but at least they've covered a lot of the things that are just general housekeeping. Any other comments about any of this? We're adjourned. That was good.
Wait. Pat, wake up.